Assalamu alaikum. You're watching Views and News, and I'm Faisal Rahman live from our Islamabad studios. Today we'll be talking about a very important story. We always discuss about the regional alliances, global alliances, the common interest between the countries, regions. You always care for certain very important areas. For example, the economic uplift, the living standard of the people living in that part. Number two is about the military dominance. The better equipped you are, the better defense forces you have, the more influence you're going to have. And then you talk about the top P5 countries that also include the European countries like France or Great Britain, US in the West, China, and then you talk about Russia. So two Asian countries as well. All of them are nuclear powers. As far as economy is concerned, there is no doubt USA is number one, China is number two, catching up soon. But let's see what is going to happen after this COVID-19 year, I would say. Things have slowed down at every level. You talk about businesses, they've come to a shut. And you talk about other issues, they are still bubbling out there. But now there's a very interesting development. As we all know that there are about more than 60 countries that support the OBOR concept, the primarily huge influence of the Chinese towards the western side. Whether you talk about the railway link between the Europe and China, you talk about CPEC coming down all the way to Gwadar from the top north part, their investment in this particular area. And now the most important factor is about the Chinese and Iranian relationship. It's not only strategic, but remember, Iran has huge reserves of energy. That is important for China because China is an energy thirsty country. You talk about the oil, you talk about the gas reserves, you talk about precious metals for that matter. These are something very important. Iran is a huge country, much bigger than Pakistan. And because of the global sanctions and the US sanctions in particular, it has crippled its economy. But now the Chinese plan up to $400 billion investment. You talk about Chabahar, that is going to give a lot of route to the Russians, to the Middle Eastern countries. But now it seems that the Indian influence under the American pressure is getting really reduced. Whether you talk about the 1/3 of the total oil purchase of the Indians was from Iran, it has stopped. You talk about trade ties, they are almost there, but obviously the Chinese influence is much more. They want to develop the infrastructure, they want to help them in agriculture side. As far as military hardware is concerned, Chinese have also opted for that. Or you talk about certain other industries that are practically shut in Iran, especially the oil refineries and all. The new spare parts and the developments, that is also something very crucial now. This is going to change the balance in the region for sure. Americans, they have a lot of presence in the Middle East. They are looking at the situation very closely. They're monitoring it. At the same time, a lot of contracts which earlier the Indians were opting, but since lack of resources and a couple of other issues, made sure that they should stay back, and the Chinese, they have moved forward. So this is something very important for the region, very productive for the region, and is also going to create a very perfect scenario where there's going to be a lot of Chinese influence in the Iranian side. Ties between Pakistan and Iran would definitely improve. Obviously, when there's going to be economic uplift, things would change out there in that part of the border as well. So primarily we'll be talking about these issues. Now that's a huge issue actually, if you put it in one. But let me introduce you to our panelists. Today we'll be talking to Air Vice Marshal retired Faiz Amir Saab, who's a senior military analyst. Faiz Amir Saab, thank you very much for taking out your time and talking to PTV World, sir. We will also be talking to Dr. Aqab Malik, Foreign Affairs expert. Dr. Aqab, it's a pleasure to have you as well, sir. And we'll be talking to Dr. Adnan Bukhari, who's a strategic analyst, as well as Kambar Nadri from the Press Television, Iran. But let me start off the program from Air Vice Marshal Faiz Amir. So first of all, now let's talk about the Chinese-Iranian relationship. We all know that the Indians were trying their level best to build up Chabahar, and they were investing a lot in the infrastructure sector, whether you talk about the road link or the railway link. But still, because of the American pressures and the sanctions on the Iranians, the Indians had to withdraw to a certain extent. First of all, so let's throw light on that particular part. Should we consider this, that the Indian influence is going to be reduced to a certain level in Iran, whereas the Chinese influence, because of this mega investment, is definitely going to be the game changer? I think there's some technical problem with Faiz Amir Sab. We'll put the same question to uh, Ukab Malik. Hello? Ukab, can you hear me? All right, but I think there's some technical problem which is going to be sorted out in less than a minute. But let me also brief you till the time we get the proper connection with our panelists. Now, as we all know that Tehran has been hit by the American sanctions, and this is not something new. Whether you talk about their nuclear program, or you talk about the export of their energy resources, or you talk about the equipment of machinery, whether you talk about the equipment needed to upgrade the air force. But Iran, as we all know, when you talk about the geographic location of that country, look at the importance. Almost 70% of the oil that comes from that part goes very closely all the way into the Gulf. Now, Iran's strategic location is also very important because Iran can stop and halt the overall supply to the globe, I would say. And in that case, the oil prices could reach to an unimaginable level. No matter we're going green, we are slowly but surely not depending much on the oil or on other sources. Rather, we're getting hybrid. We're getting clean energy either through the wind, or we talk about the solar for that matter. But these are the realities. These are something which I believe is going to be the game changer in the region. Second important part that since we will be talking about the regional issues, let me once again go back to Air Vice Marshal Faiz Amir Saab, who is online with us. Faiz Saab, I hope you heard my question about the Chinese and the Iranian relationship. Let's throw light on its strategic part, on its economic part, and what sort of a difference can these two countries create in the region. Faiz Amir Saab.
Let's first establish a radio link. Can you hear me? Faisal? Faisal, do you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you now, sir.
Okay, thank you. So the deal between Iran and China has been in the making for quite some time. Previously, probably it was September last year that there were questions asked from Chinese foreign minister as well as the foreign spokesperson who denied at that time. But there were rumors that China and Iran are working on a relationship, a long-term relationship. Now, this deal has yet not been ratified by the Iranian Majlis, or it has not been approved, signed by the Chinese so far. That's the news that we have. Looking at the deal, it's a very comprehensive. It's a security and economic partnership at the strategic level. When you look at 25 years cooperation, it is definitely strategic, in which the Chinese are going to get a substantial discount on their oil purchases from Iran for the next 25 years, whereas the Iranians would get the much boost. Let's admit that the Iranian regime has been pushed back to the wall by the American sanctions, and more recently by the COVID. So all these put together, it's a breather, it's a life-infusing breather for the Iranian regime. If it is signed and if it is ratified by both the countries, I think some countries would look at it as a defiance against the Americans, because the American Foreign Office has announced that they would continue to impose cost sanctions on the Chinese companies who will deal with China. And China has not replied, but China is set to go ahead with the contract. But this particular deal was a need for both the countries. China has to extend its security perimeter in its backyard, which is Central Asian republics, Afghanistan, Iran, and Pakistan. And in Pakistan, definitely it needs to secure the CPEC route, which wouldn't be secure if Afghanistan and Iran remain in tumult. So I think this is a very the need for the Chinese to totally make the Gwadar deal, Gwadar port operationalized. For Iran, it's God sent. They needed some economic activity. Their economy has shrunk by 7.6% last year. Their oil production is down by 37%, and this deal is going to obviously More than that, more than the economic impact, this is going to give them a support from one of the two major powers at the world fora. So that would again count a lot for the Iranians. Now, if you look at in this contrast, if you look at the U.S. has actually pushed Iran in the Chinese arms by revoking the JCPOA deal and then reimposing sanctions on the Iranian economy, Iranian companies, and then also asking Europe to renew their sanctions and put more sanctions. And actually, it coerced Europe to walk out on its deal, though they haven't literally walked out, but they have actually stopped dealing with Iran. So this is a godsend for Iran. This was much required strategic initiative that the Chinese must have planned maybe 5, 10 years back. They have secured that. So I see. What is the impact on the region? Impact on the region is I don't see India losing much of its influence in it. It would be curtailed, but it would not lose much of interest in
All right.
much of influence in Iran and in
I'll just
Afghanistan.
get back to you on that, AVM San. Let me also bring in Dr. Okab. Dr. Okab, since you have been monitoring the situation very closely, I've been hearing from you regarding the CPEC also, and then you talk about the Chinese influence in the region. Now, when you talk about the Chinese getting so close to the Iranians, I feel, this is my personal feeling, I could be wrong, that all the American adversaries now seem to be the Chinese allies. How do you see that part? Do you think China is looking for all those countries who are in one way or the other, kind of under sanctions to the Americans, or they do not get along well with the Western world?
Well, I think being aligned with China for quite a long time. It's this particular deal with Chabahar that was a bit of a spanner in the works for the Chinese. The deal with India when Modi went and signed the deal in May 2016. And that kind of upset the Chinese quite a bit. But is also a threat to CPEC and Pakistan's linkages and local regional influence in that respect as well. The Indians were trying to counter Pakistan's strategic alliance with China by going with Iran, thinking that they could provide an access to Central Asian countries via Iran rather than through Pakistan. Now, India will be out as far as Iran is concerned, which is welcome to the Chinese in many ways, primarily because not just because of the oil that is needed by the Chinese, but it's also a geopolitical, geostrategic shift in the region. Now that's been going on for a while, and if you imagine that the nuclear deal between the West and Iran was ongoing at the time when the deal was made with India, so Iran in a way felt more comfortable at that point in time, but things changed over the last couple of years, obviously. So as a result of the change, and China working in the background for the last few years since the deal with India and Iran, it's changed the whole strategic scenario around in the Middle East and in South Asia as well, in the favor of China, which will have further access, more access through Iran for its oil and gas supply, as well as further circumvention of the trade routes from the sea as well, which is necessary for China, more access via Afghanistan also in other ways as well. So it's a win-win for China. It's actually a win-win for Iran, as I feel, primarily because they've been pushed into a corner, as I agree with Air Marshal, pushed into a corner by the US, in where they find that there's not much alternative. And given that India has become a strategic ally of the US, it seems fair that Iran would find an alternative to counter and to balance the geopolitical environment and the geostrategic environment for itself. So this is what has been happening. As far as Pakistan is concerned, I think it's a good breath of fresh air after such a bad period, economic downturn. I think it's going to stimulate the economy a bit more. I think having a friendly neighbor, because we were unsure because of the deal with India and Iran. Now that that has evaporated, I think Pakistan can feel a sigh of relief, primarily also because that linkage with Jahabad going to Afghanistan um, go through Zahedan, which is only 40 something miles from Pakistan border as well anyway. So there'll be that access maybe in there with Pakistan can negotiate for Balochistan. That would be handy, I think. I think that's a future scenario that we can consider for Pakistan, to have further linkages with Iran there, and as well as Afghanistan through the other border with a more pronounced road and rail networks, and efficient ones that are not really present at that point in time.
Now we'll be also talking to Kambar Nadri, the Press TV journalist. He's online with us. Assalamu alaikum.
Salam alaikum.
First of all, sir, since we are doing a program on the China-Iranian relationship and the kind of engagement they are in, I mean, it's a great news that the Chinese would be investing around $400 billion in the next 25 years for the exchange of oil at a discounted price. Now, it seems that almost $18 to $20 billion a year. That is going to definitely boost the economy of the Iranians, considering the kind of resources they have, whether you talk about gas, or you talk about crude oil, or you talk about refinery business, or you talk about precious metals for that matter. And this is exactly what the Chinese are looking forward to. Do you think this particular decision is going to change the balance, the approach of the Americans would change, the approach of the Israelis would change, the approach of other hostile countries towards Iran? They would think twice now. Your take?
Well, without considering the geopolitical, consequences of this great deal between Iran and China, I think both countries need each other more than ever, because we know that Iran has oil and gas, the second biggest gas reserves, and at the same time fifth biggest oil reserves in the world. And at the same time, Iran needs foreign direct investment because of U.S. sanctions and restrictions, and the fact that the European and American companies refuse. These companies refuse to invest in Iran. So Iran has no other option but to rely on China. And let's not forget the fact that China has been and still is a reliable partner with Iran when it comes to trade and financial investments and so on. Chinese companies have been here for many, many years, and they have done a good job in different sectors, especially infrastructure. I think it is good news for two countries, but at the same time, as you just mentioned, there will be some changes and shifts in geopolitical balances in the region and beyond. We know that America is trying to isolate Iran with help from its Arab and Israeli partners, and for the time being, that's bad news for these countries, because we know that China is the second biggest economy in the world, and we know that China has a lot to invest in this country, especially amid the global coronavirus pandemic and the fact that many European and Western countries are suffering right now.
But at the same time, how do you think the Iranian government is going to balance between the Indians and the Chinese at this particular stage?
Well, as long as our Indian partners are concerned, they are busy with the Chabahar port. They are developing that part of the country in order to do business with Iran and regional countries, and it has nothing to do with other parts of the nation. So that's a different, that's a separate issue. But for the time being, I think the biggest development is happening between Iran and China. But as I told you, we shouldn't rule out the partnership of the Indian companies and government. They are also doing a fine job with regard to the development of the infrastructure in the southern parts of the country along the Persian Gulf and the Sea of Oman.
All right. I remember whenever President Hassan Rouhani has been asked about Chabahar and Gwadar, this deep sea port, he says that Chabahar is going to complement. Both these ports will complement each other rather than being in competition with each other. Do you think this particular move, where the Chinese would be developing one sector in Iran, they are also developing Gwadar in Pakistan, that is going to be a good merger and we would see a lot of cooperation in the future?
I don't see any competition here. I see partnership. I see cooperation. China, Iran, and Pakistan have been neighbors for centuries, and today is not difference. Let's not forget the fact that Iran has also built its side of the natural gas pipeline to Pakistan. So Pakistan is the big and is one of the biggest neighbors and partners with Iran when it comes to energy and trade. So I don't see any competition here. I don't see any geopolitical shift between these two countries. I only see cooperation and partnership, which is based on win-win and mutual trust.
All right, thank you so much. Now, Aviam Saab, I'm sure you must be hearing what the gentleman from Iran said. I remember when this project of IPI, Iran, Pakistan, India gas pipeline project was initiated, everybody was very keen that this is also going to improve the relationship between Pakistan and India. But India eventually backed out, and Pakistan was under a lot of pressure by the Americans. So they had developed the pipeline till their border. I'm talking about the Aryans. We didn't do much. I still remember at that time the president Ahmadinejad said that they can give up to $250 million to the Pakistani government so that they can take the initiative. Nothing has happened. Do you think, sir, now is the time to boost that side along with, because this seems to be not an IPI, it seems that it is going to be IPC now, Iran, Pakistan, China corridor now?
Faisal, though the initial draft of CPEC did mention pipelines, roads, and ports, but I don't see any news recently that there has been a discussion between the Chinese and Pakistanis about building pipelines either from Gwadar to China or from Iran to China. So hasn't been a talk that has surfaced anywhere about pipelines, though it is part of the CPEC. Now, what you see is the timing of you must relate any movement from Pakistan with what is happening at the moment in USA. We're just 4 months away from the US elections. And that's a very dangerous time for any American president and for the globe as well. Now, when you see the Chinese, Iranians moving ahead and signing a deal, I don't know when, maybe next month, maybe 2 months down, maybe very close to the Trump's election. The question is Trump administration going to preempt this deal or going to wait to show their reaction after the deal is signed? Now, what we see geostrategically is that there have been skirmishes. They're not skirmishes, but there have been show-offs in South China Sea between the Chinese and the Americans. And there have been show-offs and very near misses in Persian Gulf between the Iranians and the US forces. And there have been threats and there have been missiles being launched here and there. So would the Trump administration like at this time to warn Iran by any military action? That's a very dangerous question that probably we should look forward to. If Trump is going to preempt, then probably he's going to create trouble in the Persian Gulf for the Iranians to warn them not to go so much towards the Chinese side. But obviously, Iran is a very resilient country. It has shown for the last about 3.5 decades, maybe more, that they're resilient. They're going to withstand all the American pressures. But the overall scenario developing before the signature and just after the signature of this deal, I see dangers lurking in the air. And primarily because of the instinctive moves of the President of the United States, because he is not going to face his public in this November while China gets sold in Persian Gulf, not so quickly, but through a document, through an agreement, and that would be definitely a question hanging on Mr. Trump's campaign. So would he react to it? Would he preempt it? Those are the very important questions that probably we would be looking forward to.
I think that's a very important point, Raisa. We've also been joined in by Dr. Adnan Bukhari Saab. Dr. Saab, Assalamu alaikum.
Walaikum salam.
Dr. Saab, since you are also a strategic analyst, I mean, AVM Faizami raised a very important point. Now, the American election is just approaching, and look at the current COVID situation, look at the global economic meltdown. Almost $15 trillion just evaporated within no time. And when you talk about the global alliances, they seem to be changing. Whether you talk about the Middle East, you talk about Iran area, you talk about Pakistan, you talk about uh, the China Sea area, the South China Sea, or you talk about the relationship between India and China, or China and Iran, and China and Pakistan, it seems things are changing. As change is something you cannot stop. Your take, sir.
I fully agree. Since COVID, actually, things have we have seen a lot of political developments going on. First of all, with regard to COVID, we have seen the war intensifying, the war of worlds, for example, or the trade war intensifying between the United States and China. And we have also seen China's assertiveness as well in Southeast Asia and Far East. By the way, they have been asserting themselves not only over Hong Kong but also over Taiwan, and then their relationship with Philippines, with Vietnam, with Indonesia, with Malaysia. All these things have taken some sort of something negative, basically, I would say. These are all negative political developments. We've also seen the United States planning to draw down, for example, or withdraw around 9,000 troops from Germany and announcing to deploy it somewhere in India and Southeast Asian region. We have yet to see where the United States will be deploying these troops as well. But this is part of the greater, basically, geopolitical landscape that you are seeing, the Eurasian one. We're also seeing, for example, the United States withdrawing from Afghanistan. Today they announced, Zalmay Khalilzad, the special U.S. representative on Afghanistan, announced that their withdrawal from all the 5 bases from Afghanistan has been completed. So with all these things, we have seen China asserting overall within Southeast Asia also, and this growing relationship between Iran and China is one way, because both of them, China and Iran, basically have a very stated anti-US positions, and Iran basically left on its own or alone due to sanctions, heavy sanctions that have been imposed on it in the post JCPOA agreement. So we are seeing that they are inching closer towards each other. The type of deal that we saw basically is not an economic deal; it's a comprehensive strategic partnership deal. This is the highest level of institutionalized arrangement that China has with few countries in the world. Within the Gulf, it is also with Saudi Arabia, it is also with UAE and with Egypt as well. And now comes Iran. But if China inches closer to Iran, what will be its repercussions on the Middle Eastern politics? How will Saudi Arabia and UAE, which have been all along pushing for a containment of Iran, would look at it? It also has an impact on Pakistan as well, because Pakistan is closer to the Gulf countries as well, and China is not making inroads into it. I'm also seeing it also as an alternate as well, not an alternate, but as a support to the CPEC as well, because there's also a plan to build basically another corridor that connects Iran with Turkmenistan and then through Central Asia to China as well. So these are the type of BRI projects that China is running in. And the most important thing about this comprehensive partnership is that it also contains components, for example, with regard to defense and security, and with regard to political as well. For example, on politics, if you look into it, political domain, China understands Iran's regional role, growing regional and international role, and it basically supports it, right? Also, with respect to security, they are talking about cooperation basically in defense sector that also includes equipment and training and intelligence sharing as well. And Iran is also an observer member of Shanghai Cooperation Organization. And what I can see right now is that next step will be Iran stepping into the Shanghai Cooperation Organization as a member. This is my take on this.
It's an observer state, and I think they will have a very important role to play in SCO. And actually, SCO is the platform which really brought these two countries so close, I would say. Now, Dr. Uqab, there's another very important factor. We did talk about the geostrategic importance. We did talk about the resources. We did talk about the common interest the two countries have. But now looking at the overall situation in this region, now earlier, if you remember, Pakistan has a very hostile neighbor, and that is India. India has been a country which has tried its level best to dominate the Nepalese government or the Bhutan or the Bangladesh you name it, even in the Indian Ocean, countries like Sri Lanka or Maldives. So they have their own influence. But it seems that if the Americans, for some reason, since they have got a lot of contracts with them, whether to talk about the exchange of information, intelligence, you talk about the transfer of technology, you talk about a lot of other investments coming into the Indian, I would say, side from the Americans. So a lot is changing now. Do you think that now the equation is very simple? It's the US ally India, and when you go into the Far East, you named and you talk about Japan, South Korea, Philippines, Malaysia, Indonesia, Vietnam for that matter, all these countries, they have a very pro-American philosophy. You think things are really changing and there could be something very different, say within another 4 to 5 years, things could really change in that part as well?
It's been changing for a while, and it's been
Yeah.
heading in this direction for quite a while. In fact, the geopolitical and geostrategic shift really started occurring a couple of decades ago. However, when Obama announced the Asia-Pacific pivot, pivoting from the Middle East towards China, etc., towards the Pacific, that was a bit of a wake-up call to China as well, recognizing that China was rising as a power and potential contender for global power. And this is where the issue is. There are deepening fissures between different countries and polarization and formation of different blocs now. It's not been surprising for me. I've been watching this situation for many years, and I've recognized that Iran was always going to fall into the China realm of affairs in respect to how they behave in foreign affairs. To that extent, that deal that they made in 2016 with Modi was a bit of a confusion, really, because that just didn't go with what the trend was in the global environment, given that the Americans were putting pressure on Iran anyway, and were seen as a potential enemy in that respect. But I think polarization has occurred. I think deeper fissures are deepening. I think that there is talk of a new Cold War, and that's been going on for a few years already. But it's not going to be the same as the Cold War between the United States and Soviet Union. It's not an ideological war. This is more an economic, geostrategic power shift, showing who's in charge of the forthcoming changing global order. The world is changing. The influence of the Chinese in the global order is changing how countries negotiate with each other. And that's a point in fact now. And this is where, when I was in Washington last year, the whole of last year, in fact, I attended a lot of seminars and recognized that the United States is fully aware of where they think they're going to go as far as the geopolitical environment is concerned. They are expanding their military in the sense that they're renovating it, you could say, renewing it, enhancing it for future potential global conflict environment and situation where they don't or they envisage they may be in conflict with China and other larger countries, that they don't back down and they can hold their own. And that same military is expanding itself. And it's the same with the Army, the Navy, the US Marines, and the Air Force. All arms of the US are expanding and modernizing. This is the same in China, because China is rapidly doing so. Now that you've got this scenario and it's deepening the fissures between different countries, and polarization has taken effect, and blocks are forming, political, strategic, economic blocks are forming, you'll see a shift with Pakistan as well, because Pakistan is on the fence, I think, and although it's an ally of China, it is also not willing to let go of its background with the United States, which I think as a country, I'm not saying do one or the other, but I have to announce that at the end of the day, Pakistan needs to consider where it needs to stand, because whilst other countries are firmly rooting themselves in these geostrategic blocks, Pakistan isn't so there yet, especially in this particular government that is there now, because it wants to hedge its bets from all sides, which could be conducive to Pakistan in the short term, but then could also reduce trust with other countries, either bloc. So I think there needs to be a deeper thinking in Pakistan about exactly how it's going to contend, given that the situation with India, for example, has worsened drastically. Now, I said this countless times, and have been reported on it, that India is not sincere with Pakistan, hasn't been sincere, and will not be sincere as far as negotiating peace deals or negotiations as far as Kashmir is concerned with Pakistan. It is not in its interest to do so. So Pakistan has to recognize that it can't have wishful thinking anymore. It has to make sincere, real, hard decisions as far as where it goes, really, which will contend with a lot of the different power centers in Pakistan, will be fighting with each other as far as which way it will go, but it has to make a decision in the end. I think it can't hedge its bets all the time. It may have another 4, 5, 10 years, but I think the polarization and global blocks is really forming, and now and it's increasing the separation. And when that occurs, coming to the middle is going to be very difficult between these parties. It's a contention between global power and how the global world order will work in the future. And that's what the United States want to continue, its dominance, but also the liberal democratic order. Whilst the Chinese don't have a liberal democratic orientation. So international institutions will be affected. How the world works will be affected. And that matters now. Now, so we have to really appreciate how we're going to go about this. Which way are we going to go? Are we going to go towards a democracy? Are we going to go towards a non-democracy global environment influenced by non-democratic or authoritarian ways of thinking? That's what we really have to make a decision on.
All right. Now, generally, AVM Saab, it is believed that this contract is going to be signed around March next year. So you're looking at not exactly post-COVID, but kind of a situation where things would be very clear that where do we stand? I mean, if the SOPs are in place for another, let's say, maybe 8-9 months, things would be a lot better. So, and maybe the economic revival would be there as well. China being such a huge country when it comes to investing in other countries, and we understand that it is generally believed that wherever the Chinese are investing, just close your eyes and invest there, because they always do their homework very right. I mean, they do understand that where the profit stands and how to go forward with such huge contracts. Do you see this entire area changing? I mean, where there was once the American dominance, talk about the Middle East. The Chinese silently were investing in Africa at that time. They were investing slowly but surely in all the Middle Eastern countries too. You talk about the Far East Asian side. Again, a lot of American influence, military presence, a lot of threat for the Chinese, Malacca Islands and all these sides. But now it seems that the Chinese, they have opened up almost everywhere, towards Russia, towards Europe, down towards Pakistan and otherwise also. Even they had plans with the Indians, with the Bangladesh government as well. So that Chinese expansion, not the military expansion I'm talking about the influence of the Chinese in terms of investments and having some support from the region. Do you see the dynamics of this region, whether you talk about the Middle East or you talk about Far East or you talk about the Indian Ocean, that is going to change slowly but surely?
I think the change is already visible. The major impact of this deal, the political impact in the region, is that the American dreams of change in regime have been shattered. So far, the Americans were relying on their sanctions, the maximum pressure campaign that they were relying on, that they would put so much pressure that the people from within the country, and there were occasions where the people rose, people within the country would come out on the streets and demand a regime change. Now, with the economic conditions improving, I think that American dream is in danger. Now, when you look at this particular deal, it is not only so much the military part of it. There is talk of high-speed railways, subways. There have been talks of special economic zones in Iran. There are free trade zones in Iran they've been talking about. The Chinese are also thinking of moving in their 5G network in Iran, asking Iran to join the Chinese global positioning system, Beidou. So there is a lot of economic activity, and when these economic activities start to pick up acceleration, start to accelerate, definitely they will see a binding between two bigger countries, Iran and China, and also influencing probably the relationship between the three countries, and you might see a triangle, uh, independent independent states, but having very close working relationship between Pakistan, Iran, and China. And if that happens, I was wondering how far would be Afghanistan from joining CPEC or BRI. So next, probably in next couple of years, when the Afghanistan stabilizes, you might see the entire area forming an economic bloc: China, Afghanistan, Iran, and Pakistan. And this would be a great game changer within this particular region. This would obviously have the military repercussions, but more than that, probably when China starts to invest in these three countries, it will also be supporting them in ensuring their own safety and security. Now, if you look at this particular deal, this also talks of weapons development. And Iranian industry, the weapon industry, arms industry, has been doing quite well in the past. In the face of sanctions, they have developed quite a bit. So they definitely need now technology infusion, which Chinese would provide them. So you will see Iran, which is not only developing economically, coming up, unless there are other pressures or other players that start a war in this particular region, Persian Gulf. But you will see in coming years, because of this particular relationship between Iran and China, Iranian state becoming stronger, not only economically but militarily also. This will definitely put pressure on states across the Persian Gulf, and that would also probably put pressure on Pakistan. So Pakistan, I think at the moment, if it reminds me of the Cold War, where India was a non-aligned country, and while it was maintaining its relationship with Russia, very strong relationship, became the largest arms exporter from Russia, but it called itself a non-aligned country. One more thing I want to make out, just last point from my side. Look at Djibouti. The Chinese have constructed or built a naval base in Djibouti, and it is just a couple of 100 kilometers from American presence, American bases in that country. Similar, what you're seeing in Iran is there hasn't been, I haven't seen a news that talks about Chabahar in this particular deal, but you will see China and Indians working side by side at this particular place.
All right. Now, last quick question to Dr. Nan now. Dr. Saab, the Americans have said that, well, this was a very kind of a strategic partnership deal. The Chinese have done it silently with the Iranians, but they also fear that in the future there could be naval bases of the Chinese in Iran. There could be a lot of military presence as well. So if there is military presence of the Chinese in this particular part of the world, what is that supposed to mean then?
First of all, there are certain Iranian ports that they talk about. For example, the port of Jusk, which is just outside the state of Hormuz, and they believe that if China somehow acquires a military dimension to that port, basically, that will affect the flow of oil, basically, out of that Persian Gulf to the rest of the world. So Chinese might come to basically, in a way, control it, threaten basically, for example, the United States in any future war or something like that. That is one thing. Another aspect is that I see basically an enormous setback to nuclear proliferation as well, because there is some deal on which there is, like on the Iranian nuclear program, there has been issues going on between the United States and Iran, with the European Union, Russia, and China also involved in this entire thing. This might encourage Iran basically to continue with this nuclear program, irrespective of what the rest thinks, basically, especially the West or, for example, the United States thinks about it. And if this goes on like this, basically, then we can expect anything coming out of the GCC countries as well. They might have their own nuclear programs as well, basically starting it and nuclearizing the entire region. So this is another threat as well. What I'm seeing basically is that Iran has definitely taken a look east policy now, away from the look west policy. They have been looking towards Europe, basically, especially, to come to the rescue, especially with regard to the West and with regard to this nuclear program that has not materialized. And now they are looking towards China. This is it. This is from my side, sir.
All right. Thank you so much, sir. AVM Saab, was a pleasure to have you. Dr. Adnan, was a pleasure to have you as well. And thank you so much, Dr. Kaab, for your comments as well in our program. Now, this is going to be pretty interesting. This is what we have realized. But the future course of action, that is going to be something we'll be all really keen to see. But obviously, things will change, as things have also changed in the past too. Alignments change, global positions, they change. Foes and friends, they change, but the interests, that is something of prime importance. As long as they merge, there will be good news. But let's see where it leads. We can always hope and pray that it should be good for the region, for Iran, for Pakistan, and for the other Muslim countries which are very peaceful by nature. Anyway, that's all we have for this. I'll see you tomorrow at 8. Till then, you take good care of yourself. Khuda Hafiz.